Dr. Trueman, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
It's a great pleasure to be here, Amy. Thanks for having me on.
Well, here at the beginning, I'm just going to dive in and ask you this question that I know many people will want to hear your answer about. I don't think anyone would argue or disagree that there have been some seismic shifts culturally, just in assumptions, the things that many people just assume to be true, the presuppositions. And they even seem to be coming at a faster rate to the point where even such fundamental terms as male and female now seem to be up for debate or unable to be defined. And I think as parents, it can be tricky because we feel like, one, we're trying to figure things out ourselves, like make sure we understand what's going on. And then we have the added responsibility of communicating to our children what is true and helping them to be discerning as they hear things coming at them a mile a minute. But I wanted to ask what you see as some of these ideologies, these shifts, these assumptions that are most prevalent, perhaps now in our current age. And I know they didn't just show up suddenly. So, kind of, where did they come from, and how have we arrived where we are today?
Sure, that's a very good question. Huge question, a lot of ways. It's difficult to answer in any simple, straightforward, or concise fashion. But I would just put a couple of things out there to get listeners' minds thinking about these issues. First of all, I think one might characterize the broad changes that are taking place within our culture as a fundamental transformation in the question of what it means to be human. I think C.S. Lewis puts his finger on something very important in his book, The Abolition of Man, where he really sees there that it's the notion of humanity that is under challenge. He's not the only person seeing that in the 1940s. There are others as well, but I think he makes a very important point that it's humanity, the very notion of what it means to be human, that is being challenged. Where we see that manifesting itself most dramatically in our culture at the moment would be, say, on issues of sexuality and even more so on questions of gender. What is the appropriate sexual use of the body? And does my body have any authority over who I actually am? Of which, the question, what is a woman? And that statement, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body would be perhaps the most popular or most obvious examples. I think one thing we need to remember, though, when we're thinking, where does this come from? Some of these ideas have been around for an awful long time. One could make the case that the body has been a problem. The body's almost been a problem for as long as Christianity's been around. When we look back to the early church, you have these movements that we now gather together under the rubric of Gnosticism. And one of the things that the various Gnostic groups have in common is they downplay the importance of the material and therefore the physical body, and emphasize instead the psychological or the spiritual dimensions of what it means to be human. That that's not changed. The reasons for finding the body to be problematic have changed over time, but the body has always been somewhat problematic in the way of thinking about the self. What's made the difference today, I think, is technology. We now have technologies that, one, make the body less important. I mean, we are speaking over Zoom at this point. 20 years ago, to record this, we'd have needed to have sat in the same room. We'd have needed to be bodily presences to each other as we're doing this. And it's not a bad thing that we can do this, of course, but it helps shift how we think about the importance of the body. We think of the body as less important today because we don't need bodily presence as much. And I also think when it comes to something like the trans issue, why can we believe that a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man? Because we believe that technology gives us that power. We're able to gerrymander our bodies in a way that we think would allow us, as a man to become a woman or a woman to become a man. Of course, it's absolutely impossible. You'd have to replace every single cell in the human body in order to achieve that, and then you wouldn't have the same person. You just have a completely different person as a result. But that's not the point. The point is that technology allows us to imagine we can do that, and that, I think, fuels a lot of the great changes that we're witnessing at this point.
I appreciate you bringing up the Gnostics as well, and we could even go back to their great grandfather, Plato. This is not, these are not new ideas. These questions about who is man? What is his chief end? One might even say, but who are we? Why are we here? Right? I think sometimes there can be this assumption that, oh, if we can only get, I don't know, some people say like the 1950s. I'm like, we need to get way farther back than that. But, oh, if we could only just go back to this idealized time in the past when it was all, everyone understood what was true. And that, I think, really misses the point about some of these more fundamental questions. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
appreciate you just like bringing up, this is not some new thing. It's just coming, I guess it's being exposed or revealed in a different way. Would you say maybe?
Yes, and again, also one has to acknowledge that technology is not a wholly bad thing, but far from it. I don't want to live in the 15th century because I wouldn't want to live in an era where a relatively minor, what would now be a relatively minor surgical procedure would be extremely painful because of no anesthetics and extremely dangerous because of no antibiotics. Technology is neither good nor bad on that front, but like all things, all phenomena, it brings both positives and negatives, advantages and risks. And I think one of the things that we have not been good at doing in our current day is understanding the risks. We're very much in that mindset that if we can do it, why shouldn't we do it? And that I think is a problematic attitude.
Well, I see even within the church itself, because we all, even those of us who are trying to be purposefully anti-cultural or just biblical, and be truthful in our thinking, we do live in the world where we live and in our time. We can't possibly completely escape it. So where there's some maybe assumptions or presuppositions that even within the church, maybe you see us having just sort of, we're operationally living those untruthful things. And how do you see that playing out in the church?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Of course, again, we can relativize the question by saying that we don't face a question that Christians haven't always faced. And the question is, how does the church as a sort of pilgrim community within the wider culture, how does it relate to that wider culture? And it's not an easy question to answer. Uh, some want to completely withdraw. Some want to, turn the culture into effectively a function of the church. And I think neither of those options are practical. I think Augustine is the man who sets us on the right track when he's thinking about, there's the city of God and there's the city of man, and the city of man changes over time. But we're all, in a sense, citizens of both cities. We have to live in both cities. So the question for Christians is, how do I negotiate my life such that I'm faithful to Christ in the times I've been placed, while yet also fulfilling my duties to my neighbors and my neighborhood and my community? And that's not an easy question to answer. I think one of the ways that the church, one thing that the church has got to think about, and I've been puzzling over this for a few months now, but don't really have any answers, is, how do we balance online life with real life? How do pastors pastor people who are living their lives online? How do we make sure that we are using online technology and that it is not using us in some way? So that would be one aspect. I think we live, another aspect of the culture in which we live in, I think, is often, I would describe as a very anti-historical age, that we tend to be forward looking. We tend to see history, if anything, as a tale of oppression and as somehow less enlightened and more problematic than the present. And yet Christianity is a historic religion. It's historic both in terms of its revelation. God reveals himself through the history of Old Testament Israel and then on into the church of the New Testament. And the gospel has been passed down, is handed on through history. God does not invent the gospel every Sunday. How do we reflect that in our church life? Again, there's a temptation on the other side there. We can say, well, we need to recapture the great liturgies of the past, or the great hymns of the past. And that's certainly true, I think. But we recapture them because they're true, not because they're old. And I think there can be a tendency in some conservative Christian circles to think, well, the older is automatically the better. And we can end up indulging in a kind of sentimental antiquarianism, which isn't really a recovery of classical Christian doctrine and life for the present. So I would say, a couple of fronts there. There are things we need to think about.
Yeah, and it's interesting because one of the things that I have really struggled to articulate, like kind of clearly and simply, both to others that I'm having conversations with, sometimes to my own children, because children, they ask me these questions and they expect me to just give them a cut and dry, simple answer, and sometimes the answer is a lot more complicated, and
Mm,
so trying to explain it to them can be difficult. But one of these things, when it comes to history in particular, is we see if we just take an honest look at the history of the world from Genesis on, from Cain's first murder, we see examples of injustice, oppression, evil, right, at its most basic level, even in our own, all the way up to our own country's history. And so these are realities of things that we notice as we study history. And yet, in the modern kind of paradigm, it seems that oppression and injustice is like the thing that defines the entire personality of
yeah,
one's
yeah.
worldview, right? And so we don't want to accept that ideology either. But then, like you were saying about Christians kind of becoming this romanticized antiquarian as opposed to really thinking about truth, in homeschool circles, sometimes I then see dishonest approaches to history, or people who are so concerned to reject the modern error that they refuse to even acknowledge that, a historical character, it could be criticized, or
Mm.
they want to kind of hide from those harder parts of history. So anyway, this is sort of a long story to just sort of get to a question of how do we as Christians, acknowledge the evil that has been perpetrated without becoming cynical, and not ascribing to this whole kind of Hegelian point of view.
Yeah, well, there's a sense in which I think Hegel has some things to commend him actually on that front. In that I think one of the things he does is, he emphasizes you do need to look at things historically. And we do need to judge each era and each epoch by the standards of the time to some extent. And that can allow us to avoid becoming very Pharisaical and self-righteous about the past. But I would say, on the whole, what one needs to, of course, is, from a Christian perspective, have two fundamental foundations to a Christian view of history. And one of them is, I think, a biblical anthropology. And secondly, an understanding of what we Reform would call common grace. I think you have a biblical anthropology, then you realize that all human acts are going to be tainted at some level. And that really cuts us off from the kind of approach to history that you spoke about at the end there, where criticism of any great historical hero is off limits because they're actually, in doing that, you're playing straight into the hands of those who want to make the opposite case and damn all of history, because it's very clear from a biblical anthropological perspective that history is the history of a sinful, fallen people. And trying to exculpate our own chosen heroes from original sin just isn't going to work. And somebody who does the digging is going to come up with something that just blows that hagiography out of the water. So we need a realistic anthropology that understands that the depravity is a fundamental part of all of us and is a fundamental factor in history. On the other hand, we also need, I think, an understanding of common grace, that depravity is not the only thing. And I would take as an example, you think about critical race theory and critical, Derek Bell, leading critical race theorist, his writings on Brown v. Board of Education, which is the very important Supreme Court judgment in the early 1950s that paves the way for desegregation and ultimately for the Civil Rights Act, all these things. And Derek Bell, in his take on that, would say, it's gone down in history as the moment that America sort of realizes there's a race problem and kind of solves it. I'm putting it a bit simplistically here, but Derek says there's a lot of cheerleading surrounding Brown v. Board of Education. And then he demonstrates that, no, actually, Brown v. Board of Education, the decision was a lot more complicated than that. There are a lot of issues at play, not all of which, in fact, in Derek Bell's view, almost none of which are actually praiseworthy.
Mm.
And I want to say, well, if you have a hagiographical view of Brown v. Board of Education, then your theory is going to fall apart as soon as you start looking at some of the stuff that Derek Bell starts citing. On the other hand, Derek Bell is kind of guilty of the opposite problem. Just because somebody does the right thing out of wrong or mixed motives doesn't mean it wasn't the right thing. You know, if the man standing on the seashore who sees the person drowning uh, doesn't swim out to save them because he's worried that when he makes the front page of the news, it's going to make him conceited and maybe he's saving them because he wants to be a local hero. I think all of us would say in that situation, look, pal, worry about your motives later. Just get out and save that person. That's the right thing to do. Go back and confess your sin of pride after you've done it. And I think as Christians, we need to think of history in those terms. Yeah, our heroes are flawed. George, we think George Whitefield, great evangelist of the 18th century. But there's significant evidence that he kind of enjoyed the public attention that he got from being a field evangelist. And more than that, there's significant evidence that he terribly badly treated his wife. Does that mean that his ministry was evil or worthless? Absolutely not. But it certainly doesn't mean that when I teach a class on George Whitefield at Grove City College, I'm going to say, hey, if you've got a ministry like Whitefield, you can treat your wife like a piece of garbage. I'm not going to draw that lesson from it either. I think as Christians, we need always to look through that biblical anthropological lens of man created, fallen, and redeemed in order to tease out the complexities of human motivation and action within history.
Having that root of a solid theology and anthropology, like who God is and then who man is, it really does fundamentally shift the way you think about really any subject, right? It's
Yeah.
difficult to come to any subject, history, politics, what have you, and just try to interpret from those facts, using the word facts like loosely, apart from truly understanding that pattern of creation, fall, and redemption and all of that. So I think that's really a helpful reminder, and it gives us humility, right? And I think especially thinking about as a homeschool parent, an educator, really wanting humility to be a huge part of my children's education.
Yeah.
Humility and doxology, those are not just words. That's what I believe is the end of education. And part of that is recognizing yourself in some of those great men and women of the past who also were highly flawed. We want to think that we can go do great things, do great things for God, do great things for culture, and somehow avoid the trap of our own sin. And so it's good for us to remind ourselves, to remind our children, the story of Peter, right? Oh, if everyone forsakes you, I won't, right? And then that is the place of weakness. So I think that can be a lesson from taking that perspective on history as well.
Yeah, I mean, think of the example of Martin Luther. I've just been teaching the church history section on Luther the last few weeks. Luther writes a terrible book in 1525, calling for violence against the peasants. He writes a terrible book in 1543, calling for violence against the Jews. One of the things I try to get the students to realize there is, only a man with Luther's personality could achieve the great things he achieved. Only a man who is very strong-headed and convinced of his own rightness could stand at the Diet of Worms and, face down the might of the Holy Roman Empire. Danger of that is, of course, when you've got that, it's a little bit like the little girl in the rhyme, when he was good, he was very, very good, we might say of Luther. When he was bad, he was horrid. But you can't have the strong man of Worms without the risk of the vile man, of the harsh book against the peasants and on the Jews and their lies. And one of the lessons I draw from that for students is this, be aware of your own strengths and realize that your strengths can actually be your weaknesses as well in certain contexts. Make sure you use your strengths for good and be aware of the way they make you vulnerable in terms of when it comes to evil. Some people like to be warm and affirming of others, and that's a great thing when you meet that person who needs encouragement. On the other hand, that can be a real weakness when you meet that person who needs a rebuke, but your instincts are to affirm them. So I think there are all kinds of ways one can approach history to draw, moral lessons from without having to present the person as, hey, he's a morally perfect paradigm. Just go off and do what he does. No, history is more complicated than that, but that doesn't make it less useful, I think, as a moral tool.
Well, while we're talking about history and Martin Luther church history, I wanted to get what your response would be. I recently had a reader sent me an email actually, push back on my recommendation to study church history. And she said that in her experience, the study of church history led to people becoming Catholic. And so Protestants should only study the Reformation on and the Bible. And so I replied to her there a little bit with some of my perspective. But I know you and I are both
Yeah,
Protestant
yeah,
Reformed Christians, and we both love church history. In
yeah.
fact, you've been a guest on the Kids Talk Church History podcast.
Yes.
A couple of my daughters are co-hosts over there. And I'm pretty sure at least one of the episodes you did was actually related to like medieval Christianity. I
I think
believe it's
so.
all been pre-Reformation. So, what would be your sort of response to someone who says church history is dangerous? Why should we, especially as Protestants, want to study all of church history?
Yeah, it's funny. So I've got a mug in my office with Cardinal John Henry Newman on it, and a quotation from his essay on the development of doctrine, which says that the quotation is, "To be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant." Uh, so you're right. I clearly agrees with John Henry Newman on that one. I would say, first of all, I absolutely uh, I see the concern very much so. Yeah, that's there's a sense in which one would not want church history to lead people astray. A couple of things I would say in response to that. First of all, my own experience of teaching students at college, the ones who've converted to Catholicism have tended to be the very intelligent ones who grew up in churches where they were never taught church history. And so when they encounter church history for the first time, they don't really have the categories for knowing what to do with it. Because when they discover that church history didn't actually begin in 1517, it smells to them like a cover-up. So I would just say that that's anecdotal. It doesn't have to be that way, but I would say in my experience, it's actually been ignorance of church history that's made people vulnerable to Catholicism. Secondly, I would say the problem with that is if we want to take the reformers and the Puritans, the 16th, 17th century guys who produced the great confessions that we Protestants subscribe to, if we want to take them as sort of pretty Protestant guys on the whole and pretty normative, they're very deep in church history. Calvin is always quoting Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, 12th century. They read very widely in church history. For them, the Reformation is a battle over church history. It's not a battle between the Bible and church history. It's a battle between the true church history, as they say it, the history of true doctrine, and doctrine that has been corrupted by the additions of non-biblical, unbiblical traditions. So I would say to that person, it's interesting that you're actually defining Protestantism there in a way that Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, Bullinger, Peter Martyr, Martin Bucer, Thomas Cranmer, Matthew Parker, John Owen, Thomas Goodwin, Thomas Watson, none of these guys would have thought that way. All of them, if you look at their library catalogues, all of them very deeply read in church history because they saw the Reformation as a battle for the true historical church over against the false historical church.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. And that's one of the reasons why helping my children see that their heritage as a Protestant is not something new, but they're part of this great heritage of Christ's church
Yeah.
is so important. And that's been something I wanted to make sure they understand, that we didn't just invent something new in the 16th century, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there's some great resources now out there for kids on church history. Simonetta Carr's work. Linda Finlayson does short biographies of great figures of church history. There's a lot of good Protestant stuff that deals with medieval figures and early church figures. I mean, I have to say, if if you didn't have Augustine, you would not have Luther and Calvin. Luther and Calvin are doing what? They're rediscovering Augustine in the 16th century. To an extent, I had a colleague who used to describe, this was way back in a university in the UK, used to describe the Reformation as nothing but a set of footnotes to the works of St. Augustine. And I think that's hyperbole, but he was trying to make a point that these reformers, they're not bypassing history. They see themselves really as, you know, repristinating Augustine for a new generation. Well, that really means you need to know your Augustine in order to understand the reformers.
Yeah. Well, here towards the end, I have a few questions from some friends. I mentioned to a couple friends, I was like, oh my goodness, I get to talk to Dr. Trueman. What should I
Oh,
ask him? And now some of the questions were way too controversial. I know we haven't talked about anything controversial so far, but they were asking me questions like, what's your favorite cricket team? What is your opinion about Marcus Aurelius? Like Elihu, is
uh,
he a hero? Is he a villain? I was like, guys, we
oh.
can't bring that to the podcast. That's too much. But they
I
did
could
have a
answer all. I could answer all of those actually,
oh
but
yeah, real quick, give it to me.
Marcus Aurelius, not a bad philosopher, not a Christian, but not a bad philosopher. Cricket, I never followed county cricket. I followed national cricket team, England cricket team, of course, and Elihu. I think Elihu gets it right, but doesn't go far enough. I think Elihu, God speaks after Elihu tells me that Elihu has not said it all. And I think what Elihu misses as a human being is any human compassion for Job. And I think it's a reminder to those of us who have a high view of God's sovereignty that when we talk to people about God's sovereignty, particularly people who are suffering, we need to remember these are human beings, and abstracted doctrine only gets you so far and can sometimes be nothing more than salt in the wound. So there you are, those three
Well,
questions
that's
answered.
perfect. I love that. I will ask also a few of these further questions. So,
Far away.
all right, the first one, friend one, and since this is a specific quote, I'm going to look down so I read it correctly. But she said, given how the Western tradition has bowdlerized the graphic sexual and idolatrous nature of Greek and Roman mythology, should the
Hmm.
classical Christian movement in education rethink its starry-eyed views on the Greeks and the Romans?
That's a good question. I think that one of the things that's always puzzled me a bit about the classical education movement is, and I'm a big classics guy. I did classics Cambridge. That was my undergraduate degree. Is, you know, there's some pretty crazy stuff in classical civilization. I remember going to my first Aristophanes play as an 18-year-old and thinking, wow, the woman who taught me was teaching me Greek at the time. I thought if the BBC put this on as a modern play, she'd be writing to complain about it. And here we are sitting in the theatre and she's killing herself laughing at all these risque jokes. I think, as with all education movements, you just got to be discerning. I mean, education is not simply teaching kids about the past; it's teaching kids to be discerning about the past as well. And I would say I love the Greek myths and the Greek legends, but just because they're Greek doesn't render them above criticism. Doesn't mean we don't have to be discerning when we use them. And having done classics at Cambridge, I was in a class of about 90 in my year at Cambridge. Um, I would say classicists get up to the worst and the craziest stuff. Simply studying classics in itself does not make you a moral and upstanding member of the community. And I include myself in that way back then. So, it's helpful brain food, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to feed the soul.
Yeah, so and that goes back to our previous conversation, right? That we don't just because it's old and just because it's
Yeah,
been around for a while and just because
yeah.
it's influenced Western civilization doesn't necessarily make it good, right?
No, no.
Not truly good. Yeah. All right, the second question for you from a different friend. How much attention does modern reformed evangelical theological education give to the classical doctrine of God and why?
I think it's if you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I'd have said we're in a really bad situation. For historical reasons, we've tended to focus on the doctrine of Scripture, and there hasn't been any really good Protestant writing on the doctrine of God for maybe 150, 200 years. I mean, uh, but the last 10 years have seen a real renaissance in classical theism, a recovery of the great patristic teaching on the doctrine of God. a rehabilitation of Augustine on the doctrine of God. Some of it's come from the realm of pure scholarship. People like Louis Ayres and Khaled Anatolios have produced great works on the early church. I think that the real battle of our day is within our own ranks is the doctrine of God and the recovery of the classical doctrine of God. It's not that the people who deviated from that were bad people necessarily. They didn't understand the history behind, for example, Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 2. And so they misunderstood the terms. And I think we are at a period now where it's being recaptured, and we will see an increasing emphasis on that, both in the educational institutions and in the church. I've taught classical doctrine of God and classical Christology at Grove. Thankfully, I now have a colleague, a younger colleague, who's far more competent than me, and he now teaches those courses. But we're making it an important part of our undergrad in biblical studies that you do the classical doctrine of God and of Christ.
That's really encouraging because if you can't start there, right, you're going to end up in all
No,
sorts of crazy places. That's
yeah, yeah,
fundamental. Yeah.
yeah.
All right, final question from a friend, and this is having taught at both the seminary and undergrad levels, what are some of the differences you noticed? What was your motivation to make a change, and what was the transition like?
Well, I cut my teeth teaching undergraduates at British universities. I was on the faculty at University of Nottingham, University of Aberdeen. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Moved to Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia in 2001. Um, and enjoyed many. I didn't enjoy all my years there. Enjoyed many of my years there, and then moved to Grove in 2018. I would say the big difference I noticed between undergraduates and postgraduate students, between the college and the seminary, is the seminary I was by and large teaching people who already had a pretty decent idea of what they believe, better arguments for believing what they do. At the college, it's much more of a battle for the minds. And Grove City College being not your typical undergraduate college, but somewhat self-selecting in having more conservative and Christian undergraduates. Uh, it's not a battle of minds that involves a lot of hostility. It's a kind of fun battle of the minds where you've got young people who, for the first time in their lives, are standing intellectually on their own 2 feet, and they're trying to work out: do I really believe this stuff, or do I believe it just because I wanted to please my mum and dad? And it's helping kids like that think these issues through and think wider issues, culture through, that I find so incredibly satisfying. So I tell people I got the best job I've ever had. Now, the transition for me was an easy one. I was going back to my roots in some ways. Thoroughly enjoy teaching young people, and I think it is harder today to be a young person than it was in my day. I think that the rising generation get a bad rap as snowflakes, etc., etc. I think that's an appropriate way to talk about them. I think there are a lot of good kids in a rising generation, but it's a much more complicated world because of technology and social media and everything. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to help them think through some of these issues and to, for example, on classical theism, see their minds being set on fire by some of the old classical doctrines of immutability and impassibility and simplicity. So for me, it's been a great move. And anybody out there looking for a college to send their kids to, think of Grove. Send them to me. I'll love teaching them. I promise you.
Oh, I know just as a parent,
Uh,
especially in those teen years, as you start to see your kids really beginning to think and become their own like unique person, right? They're not just parroting back what they've heard you say or what they hear at church, but
mm,
asking questions
yeah,
in a
yeah,
joyful and a respectful way. But like, wait a minute, why do we do this thing in our
yeah,
church, And getting to have those sometimes difficult conversations. Okay, well, let's like dive in. Christians can disagree about this, but let's really think about what
yeah,
does the Bible say? What does church history say? And all these things. It's so exciting. I love the teen years just for that. Like just really
yeah.
seeing their minds come alive and a real desire to love God rightly and to love him more, I think is really exciting. So I can only imagine it would be even cooler at the college level.
It is. And one thing I've noticed is a lot of our students, they come from big, broad evangelical churches where they've been loved and cared for and pastored well. It's not a criticism of those churches I'm about to make, but many of them go to Grace Anglican, the ACNA church in Grove. And when I ask them why, they always give two reasons. One, Pastor Ethan's preaching is great. And Ethan Magnus, the pastor, a good friend of mine, and I could certainly vouch for him as a pastor and a preacher. But the other thing is the recovery of classical liturgy and theology. They love the fact that when they go to church on a Sunday, they're doing something that's been done for hundreds of years. And not only that, but where the connection to biblical truth is so obvious. So I think I'm greatly encouraged by things that are going on among young people at the moment in the Christian world. Greatly encouraged.
Yeah. Well, here at the end, I'm going to ask you the question that I ask all of my guests, and that is just what are you personally reading lately?
Oh, I think you're going to ask me if Beatles or Stones.
Oh, well, I mean, you can answer that one too if you want.
What am I reading? It's going to sound horribly pretentious, I'm afraid.
That's okay. I'm here for it.
I've been rereading all of Dostoevsky's big novels. So I'm reading Demons again at the moment. That's the last of the rereads I've got to do, and I this sounds incredibly pretentious, but for reasons for a book that I'm beginning to build towards doing, I'm reading the catechetical homilies of Cyril of Jerusalem,
Right.
which are really quite well, they're wonderful for two reasons. One, he sticks a lot of these sort of scurrilous stories about heretics in that I'm pretty sure aren't true. But, the battle where Simon Magus is being, riding around Jerusalem in his chariot driven by demons, battling Peter and Paul. So some great stories in there. But also it's just wonderful, straightforward Christian doctrine. And, in an era of political and social turmoil, it's actually quite nice to go back and read some of the classic stuff from the ancient church that just reminds you of the fundamental truths of the faith. And of course, Cyril of Jerusalem, like all early church fathers, there's no separation in his mind between his theology and his piety. So it's this wonderful, uh, it's this wonderful heart pressing, heart gripping theology that you get. So those are the two books I'm reading. You caught me at a very pretentious moment, I'm
No,
afraid.
I love it. Well, I will have to ask you this follow up with Dostoevsky. So my daughter Emma, that you have
Mm,
interacted with before, loves Crime and Punishment, loves
yeah,
Dostoevsky. Anyway, she has set herself a list of books that she wants to make sure she reads this
yeah.
year, and one of them she just finished, which was Count of Monte Cristo. And she was
Oh yeah,
finding all of these like parallel, like the themes where she was like, "This
yeah,
is reminding me so much of Crime and Punishment." So, do you
yeah,
think
yeah.
she's on the right track?
She could be. I mean, we know that Dostoevsky was. I don't know if he read a lot of Dumas, but he certainly read a lot of Dickens. And I always think of Dumas as kind of the French Dickens in terms of they write these serialized novels that have got to be a rip-roaring story. And of course, Dostoevsky is far more than a rip-roaring story writer, but there are great stories in there. So she could well be onto something. And certainly, I mean, Crime and Punishment's not a revenge story in the way that Count of Monte Cristo is, but seeing how, I'm a big revenge guy. I love stories of revenge. They're always entertaining. Seeing how he kind of loses all moral compass in his pursuit of settling scores. Yeah, there's certainly what at a minimum, I think one could say that Dostoevsky and Dumas both have a powerful grasp of the darkness of the human soul, most definitely.
And ideas about like justice and what is true
Yeah,
justice. What, yeah. Okay, that would
yeah.
have to be another podcast here.
I'd love to do that.
Dr. Trueman, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. Can you let people know where they can find you all around the internet or in
Yeah,
person?
I on the internet, I never publish anything by myself. It always goes through an editor. So the only places you can really find me on the internet in terms of writings are firstthings.com and World Opinions, which I think is wng.org/opinions. Or if you look at World Magazine, you'll find the opinion section. I tend to have something up every couple of weeks at one of those two sites. Um, Other than that, I do a lot of traveling and speaking, so you'll find videos, clips of me all over the place. I'm sure, but the two big places would be First Things. That's my first love in many ways for writing, and World Opinions.
And I will have links to those things and to your books as well in the show notes for this episode at humilityandoxology.com. Thank you to everyone who is either listening or watching. Please take a moment to share this episode with a homeschool friend you think would find it encouraging. And I will talk to you again soon.